So I am talking to somebody who I have a great deal of respect for, who has made me laugh, who has made me think, who has made me slam the book shut, who has made me go through exercises that
Mm.
have stressed my brain. Mark is joining us, Mark Manson, and you all know him for his incredibly successful book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. I'm a Catholic educated girl, so that's hard for me to say in a public forum, but I say it a lot in private, let me just say. But I wanted to talk to him because he has this new, it's a journal. And you can see I've got a lot of, I started by just turning the pages, dog-earing the pages, Mark, and then all of a sudden the whole book was dog-eared. So Mark has just moved to Los Angeles, to Santa Monica. And let me ask you, before we get to the journal, which I love, by the way, let me ask you how I find you today. How are we?
I'm amazing. Very, very well.
And tell me what makes you very well. What makes you able to say that?
I mean, the sun is shining. I'm in a really good spot, Maria, in a number of ways. I did just move out here, and it's been great in terms of just lifestyle. So much healthier, more exercise, more sunshine. All the things that the New Yorkers say when they move here. But I'm also in a good spot in my career where it's like I was so head down for so many years, and I've kind of like come up for air this year, and I've got some time to kind of sit back and think and get creative again and think about what my next step is going to be, what my next project's going to be. And that's been just like very, it was necessary, but it's also just been very enjoyable. So I'm in a really good spot.
Let me talk to you about that before we get to the journal, because I read a piece that you did with the New York Times when the journal came out. And you talked about kind of head down, as so many people are, as I try to say to my kids, you got to put your head down, you got to keep going. And I kind of feel like I picked my head up in my 50s or 60s. So thank God you picked it up earlier. And then you seem to be challenging yourself to wonder, should I throw out everything I've done? Should I rethink it? Should I expand on it? Should I do something completely different? And I think that that's a really brave place to find oneself, because so often we keep our head down for our whole life, right?
Yeah.
And rarely pick it up. Rarely, especially if we're doing something successful, we rarely pick it up to question. What made you pick your head up and get creative again?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like this is a topic that's not discussed enough, which is, when you're young and you're starting, whatever your career is, when you're starting out, you have goals, you have dreams, you have places that you see yourself in 10, 20, 30 years. It's hard starting at the bottom. There's a lot of, the odds are stacked against you, but at the same time, you have nothing to lose. Failure is very much rewarded in that you can learn and, make the next step ahead. When you get to the top of that mountain, when you achieve a lot of those goals and dreams and achieve a lot of that success that you wanted, the equation changes a little bit, because now suddenly there's this new factor of like, I don't want to lose what I just got.
Yeah.
And so what I found is that a lot of my decision making over the last 3 or 4 years was being motivated a lot by that, of like, well, I don't know if I'm, and at the time, I mean, you convince yourself of things, you convince yourself you're excited about every project, but in hindsight, there were probably certain things that I was like, well, I don't know if I want to do this, but if this is what's going to make the readers happy or the publisher happy, or, the algorithms happy, like, I guess I have to do it. And you do that enough, and it starts to feel like a grind. It's the whole reason I became an author is so I didn't have like a day job. And suddenly I found myself with the day job.
Yeah. But you write in, I read in that piece you were saying, you have people working for you, you have a following, and that there's this fear that comes over like, I got to keep that following. I got to keep paying those people. All of a sudden, the freedom of not having quote unquote a real job and being a writer, you have a real job, you have real bills to pay, you have real people that are expecting you to show up for Zooms and to give them, you know, thoughtful prompts for their life. And all of a sudden, you're sitting there going like, well, what about my life? What am I doing, and why am I doing what I'm doing? And so often people may question that, but the grind takes a hold, and they don't give a F about those questions, and they just keep grinding. So what's helped you stop the grind like that?
Well, honestly, the move out here coincided really well. So I had my last book came out in November, which was I co-authored Will Smith's memoir with him. And then, so we did that whole tour, publicity tour. And then I immediately went from that tour here to Santa Monica, and we did the move. And so I kind of like blocked out 2 or 3 months of like, well, I'm going to be moving. It's a new city. I want to get out. I want to meet people. So I'm going to take a few months off work. And it was just, I had no idea how burnt out I was until I stopped. You know, it's like I had that first month off. I was just so relieved and like, oh my God, I never want to go back. I never want to do any of this ever again, you know? And I'm like, wow, like, I can't believe I'm having these thoughts and feelings coming into my head. Like, I think I really overdid it. So I ended up taking close to 6 months off. To kind of just get my head on straight and figure out what I wanted going forward. But it's, you know, there's a lot of, you know, you mentioned the employee thing. That's a huge thing. I've got a great team. I feel very loyal to them. You've got readers and fans who expect certain things of you, and that's always a certain pressure. And I got to admit too, it's like, you know, when a production company or a publisher or, you know, somebody shows up and, you know, has a contract with a very large number on it, it's hard to say no. And it's almost like I've had to like learn this year how to say no again, to the things that I'm not like absolutely 100% on.
Let's pick that up. What's the decision process that one should go through to say no, to learn how to say no to things you're not effing excited about? Right?
Yeah. Well, I have
this. I'll be saying F. Okay.
Am I allowed to say it?
Yeah, you're allowed to say it. You're allowed to say
it.
So I should be allowed to say it, because at my age, why should I give a fuck about anything? Right?
There you go. Hey, there it is.
But I think that's something we all struggle with. And you talk in the journal, and you talk in the book about life is really kind of determining what you give an F about and what you don't, and the things you do give an F about.
Yeah. And I've got a rule, and I believe it's in the journal, and it's based on an old article I wrote many years ago called Fuck Yes or No. And it's basically the idea is like, if something's not a fuck yes, then it should be a no. And I think the tricky thing is that your fuck yes evolves over time. So things that were fuck yes, say like 3-4 years ago, aren't anymore. But sometimes you don't realize that until you've already said yes to it. And you get halfway into it and you're like, oh shit, I'd rather be home right now. You know? So it ends up being a tricky thing. But I mean, really, you know, ultimately, like the rule of fuck yeah, or to your question of like, developing the ability to say no well, you know, I think there's two pieces of it. One is you know, kind of the internal understanding of your own values and what's actually important to you and what's not. Like that's kind of more of an introspective process of figuring out who you are, who you want to be, what you want to spend your time doing, and that's hard enough by itself. But then you add on top of that, having the courage to actually say no to people, and also having the tact to do it well, to do it in a way that's not, you know, threatening or offensive. And that's also difficult. That's scary for a lot of people. And I think I'm generally a pretty agreeable person, so it's been hard for me too. It's just like to let people down. And
so how do you say no to people? Do you
You
thank
know,
you so much. It's just not a fuck yes for me, so I got to pass.
you know what I found funny? And it's such a cheesy like little tactic, but it really works. Is that if you just kind of tell people that you have this rule,
Mhm.
um, it's like I have a rule in my life that if I'm not fully committed or enthusiastic, then I don't do it. Um, then not only do people respect that, but it also kind of, you're telling them, you're like, I'm not going to show up to this fully. So we're both better off if I don't do it,
So that's something that everybody can kind of take away. If you're not feeling that you can be fully into something, you can use Mark's words and say, I really would love to do this, but I'm not 100% fully into it. That's not going to be good for you. And I have this rule that if unless I'm fully all in, I don't do it. So I hope you respect my decision, and I wish you well with it. And I want you to get somebody who's 100% into it. That's
Yep.
something that gets you off the hook and also helps them in a way, because that's the hard part about no, right?
Yeah, for sure. And the beautiful thing about that too is that if somebody doesn't respect that,
Yeah.
then you're better off saying no. So it's like, actually, if somebody gets really upset by that, then you probably shouldn't have been working with them or
In the
dating them,
first place.
or or whatever in the first place. So yeah.
What I love also about your writing, Mark, and about this journal is that it's kind of brutally honest, right? There's a section in here, don't hope for a life without problems. It's kind of like the, tough love that we want our parents, or as a parent myself, that I try to give. And then my kids, something like, gee, you don't have to be so mean about it, or you have to be so, but that, really almost as a nation, right?
Yeah.
People don't want to be told, you can't have this, you can't do that, you've got to serve here, you got to do that. So, what do you think is the benefit from not hoping for a life without problems, for hearing, no, you can't do that? No, that's not a good thing for you. That kind of tough love approach.
Well, I think, the thing that inspired the original Subtle Art book more than anything else was that I saw our culture was arriving at a place that you just described, that like nobody wanted to hear no, nobody wanted to admit that they couldn't have what they wanted,
Yeah.
that they couldn't be who they wanted to be. And it's like, that's just not life. It's just not realistic. Like, life is always going to have problems, no matter what. You doesn't matter how smart, successful, if you get up at 5 a.m., if you do burpees and meditate for an hour, like it doesn't matter. Like, your shit's gonna go wrong
Okay.
all the time. And that's just life. And I started to worry that we were kind of developing such a culture, and particularly self-help content in general, was like really just feeding people this idea of like, you can have anything you want, you can be whoever you want, you just have to believe, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I really think that we were starting to see, or we still are seeing, a lot of negative repercussions of that mentality in our politics, in our culture, and entertainment, and schools, education, in a lot of these places. Um, so yeah, I just, my original motivation was like, this is something that's not being said enough. Somebody needs to say it. Um, so, screw it, I'll say it.
Right. But what you're saying is not only to individuals, right? You're talking about our culture at large. You're
Sure.
saying, right? As you just said, our politics, our culture, our expectations, or our lack of expectations, right?
Yeah.
All of these things you're saying, hey, it's not what you think. It's not about self help. It's not about, you can't be just positive all the way. Here's the dose of reality.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that's something that you think that kind of, people don't get enough of.
Yeah, or it doesn't sink in enough. I don't know, maybe I'm nostalgic, or it just feels like previous generations there was a little bit more understanding that
Mhm.
things don't go your way all the time.
Yeah.
And that needs to be okay. Like, you need to be
Yeah.
okay with that. And if a population reaches the point where enough people are not okay with things not going their way, then everything breaks. and um, and that's a scary thing, that's on a population level, it breaks, but on a personal level, you don't learn, you don't grow, you start denying reality, you start becoming very narcissistic and self-absorbed, it's just a bad thing all around. And it's just, I felt like it's a point in a narrative that like needs to be pushed in society a little bit more.
Yeah, so in this book, you kind of divide it into several sections here, and Mark begins with, which I love, shut up and be grateful, and then he asks you to write down, and I want to, there's all of these empty pages. I wrote them down in my journal, but and he prompts you, and then here's your fuck it list, and then you're cut the emotional crap. And then don't hope for life without problems. And then you talk about fuck happiness. And you talk 5 things that prevent happiness, which is worrying about happiness, worrying that you're worrying about happiness, worrying that you're worrying too much, taxes, worrying about taxes. And they're funny, right? But they're also really true, right?
Sure.
They're also really true. And then there's like profound thoughts on the left page. It says it's better to be hated for who you are than loved for who you are not. And then you have exercises here to write down, which kind of deal with visioning. They talk about your ideal life in the short term and the long term, and about making decisions. And you really wanted people, as you say in the beginning here, that this is the logical next step to your book. And you said from the questions raised in the book to the questions that the reader, all of us, should be answering for ourselves. So you're really adamant about saying, I'm not going to give you the answers. I'm going to give you the questions. I'm going to give you the dose of reality, but you have to do the work.
Yep.
Right.
For sure.
So what is the work you think we kind of individually and collectively need to be doing? Other than here.
Yeah. So, well, it's funny because when I turned in the manuscript for Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, one of the publisher's notes was, can you put like a how-to at the end of each chapter? And I was like, no, absolutely not. It's a book about values, and everybody has different values. And if I try to give somebody their values, if I try to tell somebody this is what you should care about and this is what should matter to you, then that negates the power and the importance of like discovering your values for yourself. Like that literally is self-discovery, is discovering what matters to you. Mm-hmm. And so you can't do that for other people. You can just kind of put them on a path and point in a direction and send them down that path to do it for themselves. Mm-hmm. So after the book came out, I got a lot of questions of people being like, well, this is great, but it's, I don't know what to do. So the journal is really, I guess it's a little bit more hand-holding in terms of like, okay, these are specifically the questions you should be asking yourself. Mm-hmm. It's a collection of like tools and questions that help you kind of mentally frame certain things in your life, or perhaps see things a little bit differently, to get clarity on like what actually matters, who do you want to become, how do you want to spend your time, stuff like that.
Yeah, I like this thing you say here. I say, don't find yourself. I say, never know who you are. I love this quote because that's what keeps you striving and discovering. And it forces you to remain humble in your judgments and accepting of the differences in others. I think so many people think they become someone and then that person is stationary.
Yep.
Right. And I always, having grown up in a political family, and then people would always say, but this person said this when they were 20, therefore they've changed their mind and that's a terrible person. And I always say, like, don't we want people to grow, to be impacted by the things that happen in their life, to be brave enough to change our opinion? And so many people look down on that, right? They want to be stationary. Give us the argument for evolving, for dropping beliefs, for dropping identity.
Well, it's look, if you think about yourself 10 years ago and you don't cringe a little bit,
Mhm.
Like that's a problem. You should cringe a little bit. You should be like, oh, what was I thinking? You know, because
Who was that? Who was that?
yeah, because that's the sign that you've grown. That's the sign that you've changed. So if you aren't having that experience, which is not a fun experience, by the way, but if you're not having it, then that means that growth hasn't really taken place. Um, it dovetails back to that point earlier where it's like the thing that was a fuck yes for me 3-4 years ago is not anymore today. And so I need to take that time to kind of reevaluate of like, okay, I'm a different person now. I'm in a different spot in my life. I'm in a different place in my family, my relationships, my finances, everything. And so those things all affect your values. They affect what you give a fuck about. And that's normal. Like it's not, um, there's this idea, particularly around it, you see this pop up a lot when people talk about like purpose, like finding their purpose. People talk about finding purpose like it's like under a rock or something, or like somebody left it,
Yeah.
it fell between the seats in your car. It's like, oh, it's my purpose. Great, I found it. It's like, no, your purpose, what gives you a sense of purpose is always changing. And what feels very meaningful today is it's gonna feel like a grind in 5 years or 10 years. So it's like a constant process of seeking and finding and evolving, essentially.
Mark, what do you say to people who say, well, that's fine for you, Maria Shriver, to ask that because you can do that. I can't ask that. I'm feeding, 3 kids. I've got college,
Mm-hmm.
I've got bills, or that's easy for Mark to say because he just had a big successful book. So he can sit in Santa Monica and say, oh, like, what do I give an F about today? But for me, or for millions of people, I'm fighting inflation. I'm doing this. I don't have the luxury of sitting back and asking myself these questions, doing
Mm-hmm.
exercises.
Oh yeah, these are absolutely first world problems. It's interesting. I talk about this in my second book, um, Everything's Fucked, the book about hope, about how there's this weird trade-off that kind of happens where it's like the more materially successful you are, or the more abundance, the material abundance you have, um, the more optionality opens up to you. And so it actually, if you're struggling, if you're in poverty, or if you're a subsistence farmer in Africa or whatever, like meaning is a very easy question to answer. It's like get food, survive,
Yeah.
make sure the kid survives. That's it. Like it doesn't go past that. So a lot of these existential questions about meaning and purpose and who am I and what am I here for and all this stuff, you don't have time to worry about. It doesn't even occur to you. And this is kind of why we see this paradox of like the most affluent parts of the world tend to have the highest rates of mental health issues, highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, drug overdoses. And I think it's because we basically traded out kind of this physically precarious existence
Mhm.
for a psychologically precarious existence.
Mm.
It's really hard to know, as we sit here in our beautiful homes in LA and talk on Zoom, an amazing piece of technology. It's actually very hard to know what to give a fuck about because there's a lot of choices and those choices are always ambiguous and it's unclear what's worth pursuing and what's not. There's trade-offs to everything. And so it can torture you. It can literally keep you up at night worrying about these things.
I talk to so many young people, also Mark, who say there's so many things to give a fuck about, and they're so big
Yep.
that I'm paralyzed by it, and I can't give a fuck about anything because I don't know whether to focus on poverty or mental health or climate change or the demise of the two-party political parties or our democracy or
Yeah.
oh my god, or white supremacy. The list just keeps going, and each one of these issues are so big, and I don't know. So I won't give an F about anything.
Yeah, well, it gets overwhelming at a certain point.
Yeah.
And I hear that a lot from young people as well. And I kind of have this argument that isn't particularly popular, but I believe is true, which is I think the internet has kind of caused us to become too globally concerned, and not enough locally concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's probably I'm not saying that global problems aren't important and that we shouldn't
Yeah.
care about them. I'm just saying that like the prioritization or the balance between global and local is probably out of whack. Like we could probably do with fewer people worrying about, things like climate change, or world hunger, and we could do with more people worrying about, you know, their school district or the homelessness in their neighborhood or, whatever. Because it's not only do I think that that has actual like repercussions, socially, but in terms of finding meaning and purpose, you're much more likely to affect your immediate environment. Like you can go volunteer at your local school. You can go help. You can go volunteer at a homeless shelter. You can like get involved in your city council's campaign or whatever, and push for a cause. Like you can actually see change happen pretty quickly,
Yeah.
if you do those things, which will then be very rewarding and give your life that sense of meaning and purpose. If you're just sitting around in your apartment thinking like, I got to solve climate change, like good fucking luck.
Like I think to your point, if you give a fuck about climate change, there's a lot you can do locally.
Absolutely.
To fight, for recycling, or to deal with trash, or to deal with pickup, or to deal with,
absolutely
locally. So I think what you're also saying is that these problems on a global scale may feel and are overwhelming, but you can find a local way of dealing with whatever they are. The political thing, you can find it locally. Climate change, you can find it locally.
Yep.
The two-party system, whatever it is, you can find it locally. Let me ask you this, Mark, because I take a break every August because I write every week and work, and I find that, sometimes I feel like I'm writing the same thing over and over, and I feel like I need to step back to think about what's important to me. Many of the questions you ask, like this journal, to sit down and really figure out, who am I now 1 year later? Who am I? What do I give two bits about, right? And for people, you see a lot of people my age, taking sabbaticals, going back to school. You see a lot of young people taking gap years. You see people going, I worked, and now I'm trying to reinvent. What would you say to people who in this summer, instead of like, going to the beach or something, what's the best way to kind of sit back, reflect, reimagine, think about yourself in 5 years, to really check in with yourself?
Well, I do think getting distance from your own life is required. I think that's why these breaks and vacations and sabbaticals are so powerful, because when you're in that daily routine and in that daily grind, it's like trying to evaluate a painting when it's right in front of your nose. You need to get away from it. You need to step back and get some distance from it. So you need to get on that vacation somewhere and go sit on a beach and do nothing for 3 days before you kind of start seeing your life a little bit more clearly. But then I also think, kind of having a set of questions that you consciously ask yourself regularly, is important. It's not enough to just sit back and look at your life and think, I wonder what I should do next. I think there's kind of some strategic ways to poke at where you are in your life and what direction you want to evolve. I believe in the intro to the journal, I call it like mental hygiene. It's like the same way you need to go to a dentist a couple times a year, or go get a physical once a year. Like you should probably sit down once or twice a year and ask yourself some of these questions to figure out, what's the path I'm on? Where do I want to go? Who do I want to be? What do I value?
What are the 5 things you can't live without? Would you say is a very good place to start, right?
Yep.
And so I asked that question because anybody can pick up this book, the journal, and the questions really help guide you there. You can take 2 days, 3 days, and they will really begin to prompt you to start thinking of your life in the short term, he says here, the long term, and makes you really, he has a whole section on brainstorming. And these are things you can do really at any age and in any place that you find yourself. He talks about the foundation for a better life. He says, this is another thing I dog-eared here. All growth requires loss. And that's something that a lot of people are terrified of, a loss of your old values, your old behaviors, your old loves, your old identity. Therefore, growth sometimes has a component of grief to it. And I loved that because I believe that we're a grief illiterate nation. I grew up afraid of grief and yet, kind of dealing with it. And I think the other message is that you have what you need to get through these things, but, kind of being afraid of grief keeps you running, right? And then understanding that growing has grief involved in it. Certain people aren't going to grow with you. And that's scary, right?
Yeah.
And that's sad. And then he talks here about how to build a better life. So this is a book that you can easily just pick it up and start writing in the book, start writing on your notes in your phone, which is where I did it really quickly. 5 things you can't live without. And then I was off. So I want to really recommend it. Not that you need me to recommend it because it's already successful and all of that.
Still appreciate it though.
Yeah, no, I think I'm giving it to my kids. I think it's really a great exercise to prompt. I'm a questioning person, so I think that's great. I also read the piece you wrote about after the Will Smith situation at the Oscars, where you wrote a piece. Have you ever ended up speaking with him?
Yeah, he and I have texted a few times. Yeah, I mean, he was obviously pretty bummed out about the whole situation, but
Yeah,
I love the guy. I love the guy. I'm not, I can't, it hurt. Like for me, it's like watching a friend do something stupid. You're just like, oh man.
But you wrote that you actually weren't that surprised.
I was surprised, but I think I was less shocked than most people, just because it's, in the process of writing his book, people forget he's a dude from West Philly, like, West Philly, born and raised, spent time on the childhood, like that whole song is about him getting in a fight and like getting sent across the country as so it's like, that is where he comes from. And I think in all of our weakest moments, we kind of default back to, a lot of kind of where we come from, like our instinctual aspects of ourselves. So, but he's a very self-aware guy. He does the work. I'm sure he's holed up somewhere figuring his shit out.
We all have to do the work, and that's
we all did, and nobody's immune to this. Nobody.
And nobody can do the work for you, right?
Exactly.
Self-awareness, self-discovery, growth, it's all up to you. It's all there for you, but you got to do the work. So, yeah. Mark, I want to thank you so much. You have a beautiful yard wherever.
Thank you.
As I said, it says to imagine where you want to be, and he wrote that down, and you are where you want to be, even if it wasn't you were writing it for someone else, you manifested it for yourself. So
it happened. Accidental manifestation.
There you go. Mark Manson, thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria.